He saw a beat-up car in the wrong neighborhood and decided the driver didn't belong there. That was the only calculation Officer Wade Cutter made before he turned on his lights. No plates run, no violation observed. Just a young black man in an old Ford Focus on a road that Cutter had long since decided belonged to a different kind of person. He had no idea what he was setting in motion, because the 19-year-old he would drag out of that car, throw onto wet asphalt, and leave bleeding in the dark was the only son of the state's attorney general. And by the time the sun came up over Pembroke Heights, Wade Cutter's badge, his career, his freedom, and the entire corrupt architecture that had protected him for 18 years would be gone. This is the story of the phone call that ended a precinct. The night was the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, not the muffled, humid silence of downtown, where the bars were still going, and the last food trucks were folding their awnings. This was the quiet of Pembroke Heights, a suburb so carefully curated that even the street lamps had been chosen for their tasteful amber glow, rather than any practical utility. The oak trees lining Granger Road stood in rows so uniform they looked planted by committee, which they had been in 1987, according to the bronze plaque at the neighborhood's entrance. The lawns behind their iron fences were so manicured they appeared almost two-dimensional in the dark, like a painted backdrop for a life that most people would never actually live. Darius Holt had driven this road 11 times before tonight. He knew its rhythm, the slight rise before the overpass, the stretch where the speed limit dropped from 40 to 30 for no obvious reason, the blinking yellow light at Granger and Whitfield that had been broken for 3 years because the county couldn't agree on who was responsible for fixing it. He knew this road the way a person knows a shortcut, not with affection, but with the functional knowledge of someone who had decided that this particular path shaved 12 minutes off a drive that already felt too long after the shift he'd just finished. Darius was 19 years old, pre-med sophomore at Caldwell State University, carrying a 3.91 GPA through the kind of grinding effort that looked effortless from the outside and felt like running uphill in wet shoes from the inside. He had spent the last 6 hours at the East Side Free Clinic downtown, where he volunteered twice a week, not for the resume credit, though it helped, but because his mother had spent most of his childhood in county hospital waiting rooms, where the chairs were bolted to the floor and nobody looked at you like they were in a hurry to help. He intended to be a doctor. He believed with a conviction that sometimes surprised even him, that medicine was only meaningful if it reached the people who needed it most. Tonight, he had helped triage 17 walk-in patients. He had cleaned a gash on an elderly man's forearm. He had held a crying child still during a tetanus shot. He had sat with a woman in her 50s who didn't speak enough English to fill out the intake form, and he had used his halting college Spanish to help her complete it line by line. He was exhausted in the way that only happens when you have spent your energy on something that actually matters. The passenger seat held the evidence of his day, a battered anatomy textbook with a blue latex surgical glove tucked between the pages as a bookmark, a protein bar with 2 bites taken out of it, and his Caldwell State lanyard coiled on top of everything. The car itself was his Uncle Marcus's, a 2009 Ford Focus, with a dented rear quarter panel and a check engine light. Marcus had been meaning to address for somewhere between 3 and 18 months, depending on who was telling the story. His father had offered him a newer car many times. "Take the Audi. It's just sitting there. You need something reliable." Darius declined every time. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a belief harder to articulate than it was to feel that the kind of doctor he wanted to become needed to stay tethered to ordinary struggle. The moment you start moving through life in a vehicle that announces your distance from it, something important begins to slip. The radio was playing something low and instrumental, jazz drifting in and out of signal clarity, depending on how many trees stood between the antenna and the tower. He turned it down rather than let it crackle into static. 17 minutes from home. He was thinking about his anatomy midterm. He was thinking about whether the rice and beans in his refrigerator had been there 4 days or 5. He rounded the curve before the Granger-Whitfield intersection, passed under the blinking yellow light, and continued south. He did not know that someone was already watching him. Officer Wade Cutter had been with the Pembroke Heights Police Department for 18 years, 4 months, and if you asked him, and he had been known to calculate it aloud in the break room, approximately 11 days. In that time, he had received 2 commendations, both for traffic stops that his colleagues described in private using significantly less heroic language than the official paperwork suggested. He had accumulated 14 complaints filed with Internal Affairs, ranging from excessive force to racially biased stops to conduct unbecoming a sworn officer. All 14 had been closed without disciplinary action, a record that Captain Dennis Farrow had maintained with the quiet practiced efficiency of a man who understood that certain officers were more useful when they remained unconstrained by consequence. Cutter was not stupid. He was in many ways more dangerous for not being stupid. He understood optics. He knew the language of procedure well enough to weaponize it. He had learned long ago that prejudice in a modern police department needed to wear the costume of strategy, of professional instinct, of street knowledge, never the raw, unvarnished face it actually wore in the parts of his brain where the real decisions lived. He was sitting in the passenger seat of a Pembroke Heights cruiser parked at the entrance of Waverly Court, a cul-de-sac off Granger Road, nose pointed toward the street. Engine idling. Interior lights off. The cruiser was partially screened by a privacy hedge that had been allowed to overgrow the property line, a violation Cutter had noted, and deliberately not cited, because the overgrowth made this corner useful. Beside him in the driver's seat sat Officer Travis Polk. 26 years old, 9 months on the job, still technically in field training. Not a cruel man by nature, but something potentially more dangerous in the immediate term, a young officer who had tied his entire professional identity to the approval of the man beside him, and who had not yet built the internal scaffolding necessary to say no when that man nodded. He wanted to be a real cop in the way Cutter defined it. He hadn't yet thought to ask whether Cutter's definition was worth wanting. At 11:14 p.m., the headlights of a Ford Focus appeared at the north end of Granger Road. Cutter set down his coffee. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but Polk felt the shift in the car, the way you feel air pressure change before weather. The Focus rolled south at exactly 29 miles per hour in a 30 zone. It came to a complete clean stop at the Granger-Whitfield intersection, full stop behind the line 2 full seconds. Both directions checked, then continued south. Cutter watched it pass. His eyes didn't follow the car, so much as they absorbed it, cataloged it, ran it through the private algorithm he had built over 18 years, and never once spoken aloud. Old car, dented young black driver alone. No reason to be in Pembroke Heights at this hour. He said none of this out loud. Instead, he said, "Check the left rear tire." Polk looked at the MDT. "What about it?" It crossed the fog line at the stop. Failure to maintain lane. Cutter was already putting the car in drive. "Light him up." Polk looked through the windshield at the Focus 40 yards ahead, perfectly centered in its lane. He had been watching the whole time. The tire had not crossed any line. "Are you sure I didn't see?" Cutter looked at him. Just that. No words. Just the weight of 18 years and 14 buried complaints, and the particular look of a man who has never once been made to answer for a decision he has made. Polk looked back at the road. Cutter hit the lights. The strobing red and blue filled Darius's mirrors so suddenly that his hands tightened on the wheel before his mind had caught up with what was happening. Then the training took over, and it arrived not as thought, but as body, the way things do when they have been practiced enough times to become reflex. He activated his turn signal. He pulled smoothly onto the wide shoulder beneath an amber street lamp and shifted into park. He killed the engine. He turned off the radio, cutting the jazz mid-note. He pressed all 4 window buttons simultaneously and felt the cool night air pour in. He turned on the interior dome light. He placed both hands at 10 and 2 on the top of the steering wheel and didn't move them. His father had given him the protocol when he was 13, not as a conversation, as a briefing. Raymond Holt had produced a yellow legal pad and gone through it point by point, the way he argued cases methodically, with the emotional investment of a man who understands that precision is the difference between his child coming home and not. Now, on the shoulder of Granger Road, as boots hit asphalt behind him, Darius heard his father's voice arrive in fragments, not as memory, but as instruction embedded in his muscles. Windows down. He had already done it. Dome light on. Done. Hands visible 10 and 2. Do not move them without permission. Done. Announce every movement before you make it. Comply even when they are wrong. The street is not the courtroom. Survive the street. I will handle the rest. His heart was hammering, not with panic exactly, but with the particular fear that does not respond to reason, because it was never rooted in reason. It was rooted in knowing, in years of watching what happened to people who hadn't been prepared. He breathed, counted, held. Behind him, Cutter climbed out and adjusted his utility belt with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has performed this ritual so many times, it has become ceremony. Polk stepped out on the passenger side. For one fraction of a second, Polk looked across the roof of the cruiser, at the Focus 4 open windows, interior light glowing warm hands clearly on the wheel. He felt something tighten in his chest that wasn't excitement. He unclipped his flashlight and followed his partner toward the car. Cutter reached the driver's side window and directed the beam of his flashlight directly into Darius's eyes. Not at his hands, not sweeping the interior for threat indicators. Straight into his eyes, full intensity, close range, a visual assault wearing the costume of procedure. Darius turned his face a few degrees away from the beam, but kept his hands on the wheel. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Cutter said. No greeting. No explanation for the stop. Just the demand, flat and fast, the way you speak to something you don't particularly respect. Good evening, officer. Darius's voice was clear and level, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this in his head hundreds of times, and for whom that rehearsal had now become something he was grateful for. My license is in my wallet, right rear pocket. Registration is in the glove box. I need to reach for both. Is that all right? Cutter leaned slightly closer to the window. The smell of stale coffee and something sour entered the car. He was studying Darius's face with an expression that contained no curiosity, only assessment. The inventory of a man deciding what something is worth. The calm bothered him. In 18 years of stops on this road, he had come to understand nervousness as his natural due, the fidgeting, the over-explanation, the trembling that told him the badge was working. Calmness read to him as defiance, not as innocence, never as that. Get your papers, Cutter said. Yes, sir. Darius moved his right hand from the wheel, slowly announcing the motion with his body, before his arm moved and reached toward the glove box. Polk was at the passenger window. The glove box, when it opened, held the organized chaos of a borrowed vehicle, old service receipts, a travel-size hand sanitizer, 2 pens, a hard-shell sunglasses, case black rectangular, and beneath everything, a manila envelope labeled in his Uncle Marcus's handwriting, registration/insurance. The sunglasses case was the size and shape of many things that are not a firearm. Polk saw Darius's hand moving in the shadows of the box. He saw the dark shape. The interior light was adequate. The situation was completely factually controlled. But Polk had spent 9 months being trained by Cutter, 9 months in which instinct was valorized over observation. Hesitation was weakness, and the first read on a situation was always the one you trusted. His adrenaline was running. He was looking for confirmation. He found Cutter's eye through the interior of the car. Cutter gave him the faintest nod. A millimeter of motion. Almost nothing. It was enough. Weapon Polk screamed. He's reaching weapon. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, and would take the jury nearly 2 hours to fully process. Cutter did not pause to verify. He did not look into the vehicle with any fresh assessment of what was actually there. He acted on the word, on the scream of it, on 18 years of practiced rationalization that had long since fused into something that felt exactly like instinct, but was in every meaningful sense something far more deliberate. He lunged. His arm came through the open window, fist closing around the collar and jacket of Darius's sweatshirt simultaneously. The fabric twisted against Darius's throat. His other hand found the door handle from the inside, pulled it, and put his full body weight into a twisting heave that dragged Darius out of the driver's seat and through the open door in one violent motion. The asphalt of the Granger Road shoulder was cold and wet from an earlier rain. Darius hit it shoulder first, then faced the left side of his jaw against the pavement with a sound that a trauma physician would later describe in clinical notes as consistent with a hairline fracture. Pain exploded up the entire left side of his body in a white electric wave. His father's voice arrived in the same instant, cutting through the agony with the specific authority of something that had been learned before the body knew fear. Do not fight back. Hands flat. Survive the street. I am not resisting, Darius said. He got the words out even through the impact, even through the disorientation, because those words had been rehearsed 10,000 times. I am not resisting. He rolled onto his stomach, both palms flat on the wet asphalt, legs spread wide. He made his body as open and legible as a body can be, made the posture of total unambiguous surrender. Polk came around the rear of the Focus at a run. Before Darius could brace, Polk drove his knee into the center of his back with the full momentum of his sprint, forcing every cubic inch of air out of his lungs in a single compressed rush. Darius's vision went white at the edges. He heard himself make a sound he didn't recognize as his own voice. Stop moving, Cutter was shouting. Stop resisting. Darius was not moving. His hands were flat on the ground. His legs were still spread. The only motion in his body was the involuntary shudder of someone trying to breathe through a compressed chest. Cutter's fist came down on the right side of Darius's ribcage. A full, closed fist strike, deliberately aimed. Something in his side gave in a way that sent nauseating, radiating agony outward in every direction. Inside the locked vault of his own mind, behind the pain and the weight of 2 grown men on his back, Darius Holt did something that would later strike everyone who heard about it as almost impossibly disciplined for a 19-year-old. In that position, he pressed his fingernails into the heel of his left palm until the pain was sharp and local and his. Not punishment. An anchor. A point of sensation he controlled in the middle of chaos he had not chosen. Stay here. Hands flat. Stay present. Survive. Cutter unclipped the taser. Last warning. The warning was theater. Darius was pinned compliant, motionless. Cutter pressed the muzzle against the back of Darius's left thigh and pulled the trigger. The electrical current traveled through his nervous system in a wave that was beyond pain. In the conventional sense, a total involuntary commandeering of every muscle in the affected area, all of them contracting simultaneously and without permission. The body betraying itself in a way the mind could not negotiate with or override. Darius's legs seized. His back arched. A sound came out of him that was not a scream, so much as the sound the human body makes when it is processing something outside the normal parameters of experience. Polk, seeing the convulsion, the involuntary physics-mandated convulsion that the device caused, called it resistance. He delivered 2 heavy strikes to the back of Darius's head. The world broke into pieces. High-pitched ringing. The cold pavement against his cheekbone. The metallic taste of blood from a tongue bitten when he hit the ground. Then the steel bite of handcuffs applied so tightly the circulation to both hands was cut within seconds deep purple, showing itself behind the metal within minutes. Cutter hauled him upright by the chain between the cuffs. Darius's knees nearly gave way. A gash above his left eye opened when his face struck. The pavement was bleeding freely down the left side of his face, dripping from his jaw, staining the collar of his gray sweatshirt in a spreading, darkening bloom. Cutter leaned close. The contempt was unconcealed. There was no performance required in the dark, no camera rolling that he was aware of. "Wrong neighborhood," he said quietly. "Wrong car. Wrong night." Darius looked back at him through the one eye that was still open and said nothing. He was still alive. His hands were still technically as open as they could be in cuffs. He had not given them what they wanted. Across the road in the northbound lane, a passing car had slowed to a near stop. The driver had a phone raised. Cutter turned his head, fixed her with a long look, then lifted his badge. She accelerated and disappeared. He shoved Darius toward the cruiser. The Pembroke Heights 3rd Precinct had been built in the 1970s by someone who believed civic architecture should convey authority through the aggressive use of concrete and the deliberate absence of windows. It smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, and the particular institutional staleness that accumulates in any space where people are processed rather than helped. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed at a frequency too low to consciously notice, but too constant to entirely ignore. It was 11:47 p.m. when Cutter and Polk marched Darius through the double doors into the booking area. Darius could barely walk in a straight line. His left leg dragged slightly from the taser's aftermath. The right side of his face had begun to swell into something that would be spectacular by morning, deep purple and black at the cheekbone, the eye beneath it, narrowing toward shut. The gash above his left eye had slowed, but not stopped bleeding, and a rough paper towel had been pressed against it at some point, and had now dried and adhered to the wound. His sweatshirt was torn at the collar, and dark with both road water and blood. Behind the elevated booking desk sat Desk Sergeant Harold Greer, 58 years old. 22 years, with Pembroke Heights PD, the last 11 in this specific chair at this specific desk. He was 6 years from retirement, a fishing cabin in northern Vermont, a wife named Carol who taught 3rd grade, 2 adult children who called on weekends. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had learned over 2 decades of desk work to process the paperwork in front of him without asking questions about the paperwork behind it. He looked up when the double doors swung open. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession: recognition, practiced blankness, and then something else, something that he suppressed almost immediately, and that would come back to him insistently in the hours that followed. "What do we got?" Wade lazy tone. Routine. Felony resisting. Assaulting an officer. Failure to comply. Cutter steered Darius toward the holding railing. "We're also looking at stolen vehicle running the VIN now." Polk said nothing. He had not spoken since the roadside, not in the cruiser, not during intake. His silence was not the silence of satisfaction. Darius straightened against the railing and looked at Greer through his one functioning eye. "That is not what happened," he said. His voice was raw and rough, but it was steady. "I was compliant from the moment they activated their lights. They removed me from my vehicle without any justified cause and assaulted me. I did not raise my hands except to surrender." "Shut your mouth," Cutter said, and hit the back of Darius's head with a flat, open palm slap. "Hey." Greer said it the way a man says it when he objects on behalf of the overhead security camera, not on behalf of any principal. Then he began to type. He took the ID from the confiscated wallet and typed the name, Darius A. Holt, into the local system. Warrant check came back clean. Completely clean. He noted it. He reached for the evidence log to begin cataloging the items. "You get 1 call," Greer said not unkindly. He pointed at the wall-mounted metal phone at the far end of the booking desk. "Make it." Cutter crossed his arms against the counter and grinned. Who you gonna call? Kid public defender won't be in until Thursday if you're lucky. Polk said nothing. He was staring at the middle distance somewhere between the floor and the wall. Darius walked to the phone. His hands, uncuffed now, were shaking not with fear, but with the specific tremor of hands that have had their circulation cut off for a sustained period and are re-establishing contact with the nervous system. He flexed them slowly. The cuff marks were deep purple against both wrists, visible from across the room. He picked up the receiver. One number. No hesitation. He had known it since he was 13 years old. A secure, unlisted line. No voicemail. No secretary. A number. His father had made him memorize the same afternoon. He made him memorize the protocol. He punched in the 10 digits, one by one. Blood from his left eye beginning to track again across his cheek as he bent toward the keypad. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, the call connected. The voice that answered was thick with interrupted sleep and became sharp within the first syllable. Holt. Not hello, not yes. Just the name. Like a door opened by someone already halfway out. Darius closed his eyes for a moment. One moment. To find the center of himself, the place his father had taught him existed, the place panic couldn't quite reach. Dad, he said. It's me. On the other end of the line, in a bedroom at the state capitol, 112 miles away, Raymond Holt sat up. Not gradually. All at once. He processed the sound of his son's voice, the way he had processed evidence for 30 years, not just hearing the words, but reading the frequency beneath them, the texture of the air around them. What he heard was controlled, deliberate. The trained calm of a young man working very hard at something, which meant it was bad. Darius. The sleep was gone completely. Where are you? I'm at the Pembroke Heights, 3rd Precinct. Darius kept his eyes on the floor. He could hear Cutter shifting his weight 10 feet away. I was pulled over on Granger Road. 2 officers. I did everything you told me, Dad. Hands at 10 and 2. I announced every movement. I asked permission before I reached. I did not resist. I did not argue. A pause. The hairline fracture that had been developing in him since the roadside finally broke open just slightly, just enough to let one thing through. They hurt me. They beat me. They used the taser. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. It was not the silence of shock. Raymond Holt had been the state's attorney general for 4 years. Before that, 11 years as a federal prosecutor. Before that, a young black man navigating the specific geography of American law, which meant he had spent his entire adult life in proximity to exactly this kind of call. The fact that it had arrived on a line connected to his own son did not surprise him in the way people who hadn't been paying attention might expect. The silence was the sound of a weapon being loaded. Names, Raymond said. His voice had dropped an octave. It was no longer the voice of a father jolted from sleep. It was the voice that had argued before the state Supreme Court 4 times. The voice that federal prosecutors described when they thought he couldn't hear as the most precisely calibrated instrument they had ever encountered in a courtroom. Cutter and Polk, Darius said. At the booking desk, Sergeant Harold Greer had finished the standard warrant search and moved on to a routine next-of-kin check, a process Pembroke Heights PD had added after a lawsuit 3 years ago involving a minor processed without guardian notification. He typed the name into the secondary state database. Clicked search. The screen refreshed. He read what was there. Read it again. His pen slipped from his fingers. It hit the desktop with a small, plasticky clatter that was in the midnight silence of the booking area surprisingly loud. Greer did not reach to pick it up. He was staring at the screen as if it had changed shape. Next of kin/parent Raymond A. Holt. Title State Attorney General. Office Executive Building State Capitol. At the wall phone, Darius lowered the receiver slightly from his ear. Put whoever's in charge on the phone, he said to the room. My father wants to speak to them. Cutter pushed off the counter. Oh, Daddy wants to talk to the manager. He crossed the room with the easy swagger of a man who has never once been told no by someone he considered worth listening to. He took the receiver from Darius's hand and put it to his ear. Yeah, he said. He leaned one shoulder against the wall, ankles crossed. The physical language of a man who owns the space he occupies. Who's this? What happened to Cutter's face over the next 45 seconds was not a dramatic collapse. It was something more like watching a building from which the foundation has quietly been removed. The surface holds for a moment, the structure appears intact, and then slowly the weight of everything above begins to find the ground. His ankles uncrossed first. Then he straightened from the wall. Then his free hand, which had been hooked casually in his vest, dropped to his side. His jaw set. His eyes went somewhere that was not the room. Raymond Holt was speaking. He was not shouting. He was not making threats in any way that could be characterized as intemperate. He was stating facts in order, with the calm precision of a man who has spent 30 years understanding that hysteria is the luxury of people who don't actually have power. He gave his full name, his title. He told Cutter that the State Bureau of Investigation would arrive at the Pembroke Heights 3rd Precinct within minutes. He told him the precinct's servers and evidence systems would be seized. He told him that he wanted the highest-ranking officer on duty on the phone in the next 30 seconds. And he said it all in a voice that never rose above conversational volume, and was for that reason the most frightening voice Cutter had heard in 18 years of doing whatever he wanted. Cutter said, "Look, your son resisted." 30 seconds, Officer Cutter Raymond said. Across the booking area, Harold Greer had not moved from his desk. He was sitting very still, staring at the computer screen with an expression that had gone beyond recognition into something closer to reckoning. He was looking at the name on the screen. He was looking at Darius, standing at the wall phone, one eye swollen shut, blood tracking down his cheek, wrists marked deep purple from the cuffs. He was thinking for the first time in 11 years of watching Cutter bring people through that door, about all the others. All the people who had stood in that exact spot. All the paperwork he had processed without looking up. He thought about them for exactly long enough. Then he stood up from his desk and crossed the room. He could hear Cutter through the receiver as he approached, still performing, still finding the angle, still operating on the assumption that this was a situation that could be managed the way all situations had been managed before. Cutter was laughing softly at something, the last laugh of a man who doesn't know yet that the world has already shifted around him. Greer reached out and took the phone from Cutter's hand. Cutter froze. In 18 years, no one at this precinct had done that. Not once. Not a sergeant, not a captain, not anyone. The shock of it was so total that he stood motionless for a full 3 seconds, which was exactly the 3 seconds Greer needed. Polk looked at Cutter's face. Then he looked at Greer's. Then he looked at the computer screen, which he could now read from where he was standing. He saw the name. He saw the title. A sound escaped him, not a word. Just the involuntary exhale of a young man who has spent 9 months building a professional identity on a foundation that has just been revealed in an instant to be made of nothing at all. Greer pressed the receiver to his ear. His hand was shaking the shake of a man doing something necessary that frightens him, not the shake of someone about to stop. "Sergeant Harold Greer," he said. "Desk sergeant on duty, sir." Raymond Holt spoke for 90 seconds. Greer listened to every word. When it was over, he hung up the phone. He stood with his back to the room for one moment, just one, and then he turned around and drew his service weapon. He pointed it at Wade Cutter's chest. The booking area went so quiet that the buzz of the fluorescent light overhead became the loudest thing in it. Cutter stared down the barrel. The certainty that had inhabited every inch of his posture for 18 years began visibly to drain. Polk's utility belt hit the floor before Cutter had fully processed what was happening. The buckle struck the linoleum with a sharp crack, and the whole thing collapsed into a heap. belt, radio, baton, all of it, and Polk put his hands behind his head and did not look at Cutter. Could not look at him. Colton Greer said, his voice threading between controlled and barely controlled. Hands on your head. Do it now. Cutter looked at Greer. He looked at the gun. He looked past Greer at the computer screen he still couldn't read from this distance, but whose presence was now radiating something he had never once in 18 years felt inside this precinct. He looked at Darius. Darius had not moved from beside the wall phone. He was standing very still, his one good eye on Cutter, watching him with an expression that was not satisfaction and not anger and not the fear Cutter had built his entire career on producing. It was something Cutter had no experience receiving from anyone he had put in handcuffs. It was patience. The belt hit the floor. They came without sirens. That was the first thing that registered the absence of sound that should have preceded what appeared on the precinct's external security feed. 4 black Chevrolet Suburbans, State Bureau of Investigation, markings on the doors, moving in tight formation down Pembroke's Main Street at 12:41 a.m. They stopped in front of the building with the precise coordinated efficiency of a unit that practices this movement. All 4 vehicles positioned simultaneously, blocking every approach angle. All 4 sets of doors opened in the same motion. 12 agents stepped out. They wore SBI tactical vests, and they moved without urgency, which was somehow more alarming than any urgency would have been. Water around an obstacle, filling space. The last person to exit the lead vehicle was not wearing tactical gear. Raymond A. Holt, State Attorney General, was wearing a charcoal trench coat over a white dress shirt with a tie knotted by muscle memory. 57 years old, 6'2", and he carried the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent their lives in rooms where everything depends on what they do next. He walked through the double doors of the Pembroke Heights 3rd Precinct without breaking stride. The booking area went completely still. His eyes moved across the room, the way his mind always moved, rapidly, completely, gathering everything at once. They landed in the corner nearest the medical supply cabinet, where Darius was sitting in a hard plastic booking chair, while a paramedic called by Greer 12 minutes ago cleaned the laceration above his eye. The boy's face was swollen on both sides now. His lips were split. He was holding his ribs with one arm, a posture he had unconsciously adopted to reduce the pain of breathing. His sweatshirt was ruined. His wrists were still marked. For a fraction of a second, the fraction that no one in the room was meant to see, but that everyone saw anyway, the Attorney General was gone. What was in the room briefly was just a father. Raymond crossed the floor in 4 strides. He went to one knee beside the chair. He placed his hand on Darius's uninjured shoulder with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the force he had carried through the door. Darius looked up. Something in his face, the composure he had been maintaining since the shoulder of Granger Road, softened just slightly at the edges. "I did what you said, Dad," he said. His voice was quiet and a little rough. "I kept my hands flat. I didn't fight back." Raymond's jaw tightened to the point where a muscle ticked in his cheek. He stood up, confirmed with the paramedic that Darius was stable for transport, arranged for an SBI security detail to accompany the ambulance. Then he stood at the door and watched as his son was wheeled out into the night on a gurney. The door closed. Raymond Holt turned back to the precinct, and the father disappeared, completely consumed by something that was not anger in the conventional volcanic sense. It was colder than anger. It was the specific, terrible resolve of a man who has been waiting 30 years for the exact tools he now holds and intends to use all of them. He looked at SBI Director Carl Massey. "Lock the building," Raymond said. "Sever their server access. Every second of footage from Cruiser 34, dash cam, body cam, interior audio, secured in the next 8 minutes. He turned to Greer, who was standing beside his desk, looking like a man who has just stepped off a boat and hasn't found his land legs. Your commanding officer." "Where is he?" The rear office door opened, and Captain Dennis Farrow came through it, pulling his uniform jacket over a coffee-stained undershirt, his face wearing the specific belligerence of a man who leads with offense as a defense mechanism. "Mr. Sterling," he started. Holt Raymond said. The single word landed like a door being closed. "You are relieved of your command, Captain Farrow. Step aside, or you will be arrested for obstruction of justice." Farrow's mouth stopped working. He looked at the SBI agents now stationed throughout his precinct and took one step back. It was the most consequential step of his career, though he didn't know it yet. The evidence room at the Pembroke Heights 3rd Precinct was small and gray, and lit by a single overhead fixture. SBI Director Massey had set up a secure laptop and portable monitor. Raymond Holt stood at the table with 2 senior investigators and the technician who had pulled the data directly from Cruiser 34's onboard drive. "No modification attempts," the technician said. "Drive is intact. They didn't have time." "From the moment the vehicle left Waverly Court," Raymond said, "the footage began." Raymond Holt stood with his hands at his sides and watched what his son had survived, and what he understood watching it, that dozens of others had survived or not survived in comparable moments on comparable roads, with no phone call to make and no one coming. The audio inside the cruiser came first. Cutter's voice, casual and private, profiling the focus, before running a single plate, before taking a single piece of information. A rolling probable cause. You think a kid driving that piece of junk lives up in the heights. Pokes one faint objection. Then the lights. Then Darius. The 4 open windows. The dome light. Hands at 10 and 2 as clearly visible as hands can be. His voice calm and precise, announcing every movement, asking permission. Then the explosion. The body cam shook violently as Cutter lunged through the window. The audio captured the sound of Darius hitting the asphalt, a sound that made one of the senior investigators close his eyes briefly and reopen them. It captured Darius shouting his compliance while pinned beneath 2 men. It captured the specific high-pitched discharge of the taser and the involuntary cry that followed, and then Cutter's voice calling it resistance, and then Polk's blows to the back of a boy's head. Throughout the footage, Darius's hands remained visible, flat on the ground, open, never once forming anything that could be described, even charitably, as a threat. The video ended with Cutter's laughter in the cruiser on the way to the precinct. The silence in the evidence room afterward was the kind that has weight. Director Massey, who had attended more than 200 evidence screenings in his career, looked physically ill. He was a man trained to maintain clinical distance as a professional requirement, and he was not maintaining it. Raymond's hands at his sides had curled into fists at some point during the footage. He did not appear to notice. The nod one of the investigators said, "Before Polk called weapon." Cutter nodded. "Yes," Raymond said. "That's premeditated escalation. That's conspiracy. Yes." He looked at Massey. "Add it to the charges. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights. I want the federal charges drafted tonight. I want the FBI field office contacted in the next hour." He paused. "Pull Cutter's internal affairs file. Everything Farrow has been closing for 7 years. I want to know exactly what we're looking at." The file arrived. 14 entries. 7 years. All closed, all signed by Farrow. 3 of them involving individuals who appeared in the county prosecutor's case records. People charged with offenses that, on review, appeared predicated on fabricated probable cause. Massey looked at the file for a long time. "He's been running a one-man hunting operation," he said quietly. "Bring Cutter to interrogation room A," Raymond said. "I want a word with him." Cutter had been sitting in interrogation room A for 23 minutes when the door opened. In that time, he had cycled through the available positions. First, residual defiance, the practiced performance of a man who had sat across from his own IA investigators many times and walked out the other side intact. Then something colder settling in, as the specific preparations around him. The seized servers, the evidence drive pulled clean. The SBI agents processing his precinct began to accumulate into a picture he could not arrange into anything comfortable. By the time Raymond Holt came through the door, Cutter was sweating, and the fine tremor in his hands cuffed to the steel ring on the table was something he could not control, and that he resented deeply. Raymond came in carrying a manila folder. He did not sit down. He stood at the end of the table, looking down at Cutter from a height that was not only physical. He opened the folder and arranged its contents in a row on the table without speaking high resolution. Still photographs full color, each one time-stamped. Freeze frames from the body cam. The yellow registration envelope, clearly a registration envelope. The arms spread wide in surrender on wet asphalt. The taser pressed to the back of a compliant boy's thigh. Cutter looked at them, looked away, looked back. "My son announced every movement and asked your permission before making each one," Raymond said. His voice was if anything quieter than it had been during the phone call. The quieter he spoke, Cutter was understanding the worse things were. "He did this because I trained him to. Because I knew that without that training, the probability of him surviving an encounter with someone who holds your particular view of his worth as a human being was unacceptably low." He pointed to the first photograph. This is his hand reaching for a registration envelope. Visible, labeled clearly a registration envelope. For a car that, according to your radio logs, you never ran the plates on before pulling him over. He pointed to the second. This is your partner looking to you for a signal. This is you providing it. He pointed to the third. And this is you administering a taser to a boy who was already face down and compliant because his compliance gave you nothing to use against him. Cutter said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I pulled your internal affairs file," Raymond continued. 14 complaints in 7 years. Every one closed by Captain Farrow. 3 of those complaints were filed by individuals who later appear in county prosecutor records, people convicted of offenses that on review tonight appear to have been built on invented probable cause. He let it settle for a moment. "You have done this before, many times. To people who had no one to call. I want my union rep," Cutter said. "I'm not saying another word until your union representative is not coming," Raymond said. The PBA was briefed on the preliminary charges and shown the footage at 12:47 a.m. They declined representation. "When they watched what you did to my son, they made a business decision. You are entirely alone. Officer Cutter, which is exactly as alone as every person you targeted on this road for 7 years. Cutter's last structural support collapsed. It was visible, not a dramatic fall, but a settling the way a building settles when the last load-bearing wall goes. Raymond gathered the photographs, closed the folder, buttoned his jacket. Deprivation of rights under color of law, resulting in severe bodily injury, he said. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Falsification of a police report. Conspiracy to commit civil rights violations. I am conveying the federal charges to the FBI field office at first light. He walked to the door and opened it. Through the gap, Cutter could see the hallway. 2 FBI agents in dark suits holding warrant documents. And beyond them, for one brief, unobstructed moment, before the door swung wider, Darius, sitting in a chair along the hallway wall, with an SBI agent beside him, waiting for transport to the hospital. Darius was not looking at the interrogation room door. He was not looking at Cutter. He was looking straight ahead, his back straight, composed, already moving forward. The door closed. Cutter sat alone in the room with the photographs and the ringing of the silence, and the understanding, arriving now in full, that the story had already moved past him. In a smaller interrogation room down the corridor, Travis Polk was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. Federal prosecutor Dana Whitmore sat across from him. She had been called in from home and was running on 40 minutes of sleep. She was not by temperament merciful. She was precise, and precision required her to acknowledge what the footage showed and what it could support. She slid a document across the table. Plea agreement. We know Cutter was the primary architect. We know he nodded before you called weapon. We know you were trained by him in a way that created the specific conditions for what happened on that road. She folded her hands. None of that excuses what you did. You struck a compliant teenager multiple times. You are facing up to 15 years in a federal facility. Polk looked up. His face was not composed. I looked at the glove box, and I knew he said. The words came out without preamble, without strategy. Just the sound of something that had been held under pressure for 4 hours, finally finding the surface. I knew it wasn't a gun. And I looked at him, and he nodded, and he stopped. His jaw worked. He told me from the first week, you watch me. You follow my lead. You will never make a mistake. That's how you survive this job. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Then Officer Polk. Cutter is in the next room. He is currently building a version of tonight in which your call of weapon was unauthorized, panicked, and caused him to respond to what he believed was a genuine threat. He is making you the origin point. Polk's head came up. The body cam contradicts him. We have the nod clearly. But in court, his word against yours, with the footage as context, is a much cleaner case if you are sitting at the prosecution's table rather than the defense's. She pushed the plea agreement closer. 7 years full cooperation testimony against Cutter and Captain Farrow, or 15 years no deal and 6 months of Cutter's lawyers making sure the jury's face is yours. She paused. You have 15 minutes. Polk didn't need 15 minutes. He pulled the document across the table. He picked up the pen. His hand was steady in the particular way of hands that have made a decision they won't take back. He signed his name in one deliberate motion and set the pen down next to the paper and sat back in the chair and for a long time looked at nothing. 4 miles away, Captain Dennis Farrow was awake in his kitchen at 3:15 a.m. Wearing a bathrobe and holding a burner phone he kept in the glove box of his personal vehicle. He had retrieved Greer's personal cell number from memory and dialed. What Farrow did not know was that Greer had been sitting for the past 40 minutes in an SBI mobile command unit parked 1 street over from the precinct. He had voluntarily offered his full cooperation within 7 minutes of Raymond Holt's arrival. He had surrendered his personal phone as a condition of the agreement. The SBI had given him a monitored line. Farrow's voice on the recording was urgent and increasingly specific. He directed Greer to characterize Cutter as a model officer. He directed him to contest the stop's timeline. He directed him explicitly by location and method to access and delete the backup drive in the precinct's evidence archive. Director Massey interjected, identified himself by name and title, and informed Farrow that the conversation was being recorded and that he had just issued a direct threat to a federal witness, ordered the destruction of evidence, and made admissions regarding a departmental cover-up. There was a short silence on the line. Then 3 unmarked SBI vehicles converged on Farrow's home address from separate directions. Farrow was in his kitchen when they arrived. He did not answer the door. The agents entered through the unlocked garage. They found him standing at the kitchen counter, still holding the burner phone, wearing mismatched socks, 1 brown, 1 navy, and the expression of a man who has spent 20 years believing that the walls he built around himself would hold, and has only now understood at 3:15 in the morning that walls require maintenance from the inside too. He resisted briefly, verbally deploying the language of procedure that had been his professional armor for 2 decades. One of his slippers came off when the agents walked him toward the door. It lay on the kitchen tile left behind as they moved him out into the cold air of the driveway. A neighbor's motion-activated porch camera captured what happened next. A man in a bathrobe and 1 sock being walked to a federal transport vehicle, his free hand instinctively reaching for a belt that was not there. The footage would be broadcast on 3 local news stations by 6 a.m. and accompany every piece of written coverage of the case for the next 18 months. By 5 a.m., The first news van was parked outside the 3rd precinct. By 6, there were 4. By the time the morning anchors went live, the story of Granger Road was spreading with the specific velocity of a story that contains compressed into a single night every element of something people have been watching build for a very long time. The blue wall of silence that had been the operational architecture of Pembroke Heights PD for at least a decade did not crack. It did not develop a structural failure. It was dismantled piece by piece in the dark by a man in a trench coat who had spent 30 years learning exactly where every bolt was. 7 months passed. The oak trees on Granger Road had gone from bare through bud through full summer canopy and were edging toward the first signs of color again when the trial of Wade Cutter on 7 federal counts began in the United States District Court for the Northern District. The courtroom smelled of mahogany and old paper and the specific quality of air that circulates through spaces where consequences are rendered. The ceilings were high. The wood was dark. The federal seal on the wall behind the judge's bench had the weight of something that does not accommodate local arrangements. Darius Holt sat in the 2nd row of the gallery in a navy suit he had bought with money from his work-study job. He was physically healed, the fractured jaw clean, the ribs fully recovered. After 8 weeks, the gash above his eye closed into a thin silver line, visible only in certain light. He sat with the specific composed stillness of someone who has had 7 months to decide exactly how they intend to occupy this particular moment. Raymond sat beside him. Not as Attorney General, he had fully recused his office and handed jurisdiction to the federal government. He was here as a father. He sat the way fathers sit at things that matter, very still, very present, taking in the room with everything. At the defense table, Wade Cutter. The transformation was not subtle. The 18 years of accumulated authority, the uniform had conferred the physical grammar of a man who has never been made to answer for anything, was gone. What remained was someone who had lost weight in county lockup, whose face had developed a grayish, slightly concave quality, whose hair had thinned at the temples in a way that had not been visible 7 months ago. The orange jumpsuit was too large across the shoulders. He sat slightly hunched. He had not looked at the gallery since the proceedings began. He had not looked at Darius. Travis Polk testified from the stand in his own prison-issue clothing, which the prosecution had known would be powerful, and proved in practice to be more powerful than anticipated. He testified for 3 hours. He described the culture Cutter had both embodied and transmitted, the targeted stops, the fabricated probable cause, the explicit language Cutter used when he believed no one who mattered was listening, the nod system, the way a minimal private gesture had become a vocabulary for escalation that Polk had learned to read in his first weeks, because reading it correctly was the price of belonging. He testified that on Granger Road he had seen a registration envelope. He testified that he had known it was a registration envelope. He testified that he had looked at Cutter and received the nod and called a weapon anyway, because 9 months of conditioning had successfully replaced his own perception with the preferred narrative of the man training him. He wept on the stand, not for effect, the kind of weeping that carries no calculation, that is just the sound a person makes when they are accounting for something they cannot undo. The defense did not cross-examine him on the footage. Prosecutor Dana Whitmore played the full, unedited recordings on a screen large enough that the jury could see every detail without leaning forward. She played the audio at full volume through the courtroom's sound system. She let Cutter's laughter at the end of the footage extend into several seconds of silence before stopping the recording and saying nothing, because she had learned in 20 years of federal prosecution that the most devastating summation of certain evidence is no summation at all. 3 members of the jury were visibly crying when the lights came back up. The defense attorney's closing argument made the case with technical skill and no visible conviction that the situation had been genuinely confusing, and that Cutter's response, while perhaps disproportionate in retrospect, was consistent with his training and the perceived threat level. He did not mention the nod. He did not play the footage again. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 47 minutes. Guilty on all 7 federal counts. Sentencing was on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, and if the trial had been crowded, sentencing was something more than that. Reporters from 2 national outlets, representatives from civil rights organizations, a gallery full of people who had driven various distances to be present for this particular moment, for reasons that were personal and specific in ways that varied by individual but shared a common root. The Honorable Judge Margaret Voss had been on the federal bench for 16 years. She had a reputation among prosecutors and defense attorneys alike for sentences that were precise rather than performative. Precision and leniency in her courtroom were not synonyms. She looked at Cutter over her reading glasses. He was already seated, already staring at the defense table's wood grain. He had not looked at the gallery since he was brought in. He had not looked at Darius. Before this court proceeds to sentencing, Judge Voss said the court will hear a victim impact statement. Mr. Darius Holt. Darius stood. He had no notes. He had written things down over the past 7 months, read them back to himself, crossed them out, and started again, until he concluded that what he needed to say was not something he needed paper to hold. He walked to the podium. He gripped its edges. The room went quiet in the way that only happens when the person standing at the front of it has earned the right to be heard. He looked at Wade Cutter. Cutter looked back. He held it for approximately 2 seconds. Then he looked away. Darius spoke. Officer Cutter, he began, and his voice carried the particular steadiness of water at depth. Not calm, in the shallow sense, but possessing a pressure that comes from what is underneath. On the night you pulled me over on Granger Road, you made a decision about who I was before you had gathered a single piece of information about me. You decided from the distance of your headlights that I was a problem to be managed. And everything that followed, every blow, every false charge, every piece of fabricated paperwork, was downstream from that first decision. The decision that my presence in a neighborhood you had designated as belonging to someone else was by itself a provocation. He paused, not for effect, because what came next required something. My father is the Attorney General, he said. That is why I am standing here and not in a state penitentiary serving time for crimes I didn't commit. I need everyone in this room to sit with that for a moment. Not the outcome. Not that justice happened and the system worked. The mechanism. The accident of a phone number. The specific, unrepeatable circumstance of having a father whose call you could not afford to ignore. That is the only variable between my story and the story of someone who went to prison instead of this courtroom. He let it sit in the room. The room let it sit. There was a boy on 4th Street, he continued. Quieter now. There were others before him in this county, and in every county like it in the dark on roads like Granger Road, with overworked public defenders and no resources and no one coming. I want you to understand what you have actually done, Officer Cutter, not just what you did to me, what you did to all of them. The ones whose names are not in this courtroom, the ones whose registration envelopes were called weapons, and whose compliance was called resisting, and whose futures were dismantled in the dark by men who understood that the dark would keep it. He paused. You thought a badge made you untouchable. You thought the dark would keep it this time too. I want you to know I stood up. I finished my midterms. I continued toward medicine. I am standing in a federal courtroom with my record clean and my hands open and my face healed. And you are wearing a chain around your waist. He stepped back from the podium. You did not break me. What I am less certain about is all the others, the ones you broke before you made the mistake of choosing me. That is the true weight of what you will carry, not the sentence. That. He returned to his seat. Raymond placed a hand on his shoulder for a moment. Neither of them spoke. Judge Voss waited. The room waited with her. Then she picked up her gavel. Wade Cutter. She said this court has reviewed the evidence and the 19-year record of this defendant's service, which includes 14 internal affairs complaints closed without consequence. The court considers this not a vindication of the defendant's conduct, but a failure of every structure that was supposed to constrain it. You operated with impunity for a long time. That ends today. She looked at her sentencing document. On the federal count of deprivation of rights under color of law, resulting in severe bodily injury, 144 months. On the count of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, 120 months. On the combined counts of falsifying a federal report and conspiracy to commit civil rights violations, 60 months. These sentences are to be served consecutively. She looked up. That is a total of 324 months. 27 years in a maximum security federal facility without possibility of early parole. You will be transferred to USP Coleman immediately. Federal marshals remove him. A collective intake of breath moved through the gallery. It was audible. Cutter's legs gave way. Not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of movies. His knees simply stopped performing their function, and he sagged sideways into his chair, and the chair wasn't quite sufficient, and his hands slid on the polished surface of the defense table as he tried to find purchase. He made a sound that was not a word, something that began in his chest, and came out without shape, without language, just sound, just the noise of a man confronting the full arithmetic of what he has done and what it costs. The two federal marshals who stepped forward were not unkind about it. They helped him to his feet with practiced efficiency and walked him toward the rear holding door. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at Raymond Holt. He did not look at Darius. As they walked him through the doorway, the chain at his waist caught briefly on the metal edge of the doorframe. The sound it made, a single small metallic note, was very quiet in the large room. But the room was quiet enough that everyone heard it. Then he was gone. Captain Dennis Farrow, sentenced separately, 3 weeks prior, received 11 years for his role in suppressing misconduct, complaints directing officers toward biased enforcement patterns, and his attempt to suborn evidence destruction. His municipal pension, 22 years of accumulation, was revoked in full, the funds seized for civil damages, paid to the individuals whose complaints he had buried. He had wept during his own sentencing in the specific involuntary way of a man who did not know he was capable of weeping until the moment required it. Travis Polk received 6 years in a medium-security federal facility, reduced from 7 for his full cooperation and testimony. He had provided, in an irony that was not lost on anyone, the single most comprehensive account available of how the predatory culture of the Pembroke Heights 3rd Precinct had operated, more comprehensive than any internal investigation had managed in 7 years of not looking too hard. The Pembroke Heights Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree within 30 days of the verdict. Its leadership structure was dissolved. New command was selected through a federally supervised process. Training was redesigned. Oversight mechanisms were implemented that would have made Cutter's 14 complaint record impossible to bury at the precinct level. The body cam footage from Cruiser 34 was used in federal law enforcement training seminars as an instructional document on civil rights violations under color of authority. The yellow registration envelope, Exhibit 14, a 4x6 manila envelope, labeled in Marcus Holt's handwriting, slightly crumpled, entirely ordinary, remained in the Federal Evidence Archive after the trial, sealed and cataloged. A document of the distance between what something is and what a man with a badge and no accountability had decided it meant. Outside the federal courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon, the early autumn light was the flat, practical kind. No warmth yet, but real falling across the wide marble steps and the assembled press corps waiting at the bottom with their cameras and their questions, and the particular urgency of people who need a response to carry back to a deadline. Raymond and Darius walked past all of it without stopping. Raymond's press office had already released a written statement, measured, precise, containing everything that needed to be said for the public record. What was left couldn't be contained in a statement. They carried it between them in silence as they walked to the waiting car at the far end of the plaza. When they reached it, Darius stopped. He turned back and looked at the courthouse one last time. The columns, the seal, the light coming down across the stone steps. The reporters still calling questions no one was answering. He took a long, unhurried breath of the autumn air. "Ready to go home?" Raymond asked. "Yeah," Darius said. "I'm ready." They got in the car. In the rebuilt Pembroke Heights 3rd Precinct, which smelled now of fresh paint and something not yet named, something tentative, something still finding its shape. A young officer, who had joined the department 4 months after the consent decree, took his first solo patrol shift. He was 23. He had chosen law enforcement because he had grown up in a neighborhood where the police were complicated, where every encounter required negotiation, and he wanted to be something different from what he had experienced. He was not naive about how hard that was. He was committed to it anyway. That night, he pulled over a driver for a legitimate equipment violation. He greeted her by name after reading her license. He answered her questions without impatience. He issued a written warning rather than a fine because the violation was minor, and she had been cooperative, and it was the right call to make. It was an ordinary interaction. Nobody filmed it. Nobody wrote about it. It was simply quietly the thing the badge was supposed to be for. And somewhere in a federal facility in the middle of the country, in a cell that measured 6 feet by 8 and contained a cot and a sink, and nothing else of consequence, Wade Cutter sat on the edge of his cot in the silence of a Tuesday evening and held his own hands in his lap and looked at the wall. He had 27 years of walls ahead of him. No badge, no nod to give. No dark road where the weight of a uniform could be brought down on someone who had no call to make. He was in the most complete and final sense exactly as protected as every person he had spent 18 years deciding was beneath his protection. He was not untouchable. He was not anything at all. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice, accountability, and the people who refuse to be erased. Here is the question I want you to think about. If Darius had not had that number memorized, if he had just been a teenager with no one to call, what do you think would have happened to him that night? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.